The Honourable Miss Honoria Finch considered the gravel drive of Thornhold Castle, and found it wanting. It was grey, and far too much of it. The sound her carriage wheels made upon it was a dreary, grinding complaint, a sound that seemed to suggest the entire county of Northumberland was weary of the effort of existing. She had been told the Duke of Thornhold was a man of immense fortune, and a title that resonated through the peerage like a low note on a church organ. She had not been told that his home looked like a fortress preparing for a siege it had already lost. Inside the carriage, her mother, Lady Finch, patted her hand. "Remember, Honoria, a duchess can have any sort of gravel she pleases. The first step is to become one." Honoria smoothed a non-existent wrinkle in her pelisse of celestial blue. "He has been a recluse for a year, Mamma. They say he speaks to no one." "He will speak to you," Lady Finch said, with the serene confidence of a general deploying her most valuable weapon. "You are the most celebrated beauty of the season. His mother, the Dowager, has all but guaranteed it. She is desperate." Desperation was a scent Honoria understood well. It clung to aging debutantes and indebted fathers. To find it emanating from a ducal house was a rare and exploitable miracle. They were met at the grand, dark wood entrance, not by the Duke, but by his mother. The Dowager Duchess of Thornhold was a woman carved from granite and draped in black silk. Her smile was a brief, painful effort. "Lady Finch, Miss Finch, how good of you to make the journey." The hall was vast, cold, and silent. Banners bearing the Vaughan family crest, a thorny vine encircling a stoic hawk, hung like ancient, sleeping bats from the high rafters. The air was thick with the scent of old stone, beeswax, and something else. Something like sorrow. "My son, Alaric, will join us shortly," the Dowager said, her voice a little too bright. "He is attending to a matter on the estate." They were shown into a drawing room where a fire fought a losing battle against the chill. Tea was served. The minutes stretched, each one a small cold stone dropped into a well of silence. Honoria practiced the expressions she had rehearsed. Gentle sympathy, bright interest, demure amusement. Then a sound from the hallway, the click of heavy claws on stone. The drawing-room door swung open. First to enter were the dogs. They were not the sort of pampered lapdogs one saw in London parks. They were enormous, grey, shaggy beasts, taller at the shoulder than the tea table. Irish wolfhounds, their eyes ancient and intelligent. They moved with a loping, predatory grace that seemed entirely out of place amongst the delicate furniture. Behind them stood the Duke. Alaric, Duke of Thornhold, was taller and darker than the rumours had suggested. He was a man built of long lines and hard angles, his face a study in aristocratic severity. His dark hair was unstyled, his black coat unadorned, but it was his eyes that held the room. They were the colour of the North Sea in winter, and just as cold. He did not look at Honoria. He looked at the hounds. "Mother?" he said. His voice was low, a gravelly sound that matched the driveway. The Dowager's smile became fixed. "Alaric, darling, you remember Lady Finch, and this is her daughter, the Honourable Miss Honoria Finch." Honoria rose, sinking into a perfect curtsy. "Your Grace." Alaric gave a nod so slight it was almost an imagined thing. The hounds, Brutus and Cassian, had padded silently into the centre of the room. They stood, heads raised, scenting the air. Their stillness was more unnerving than a bark would have been. Honoria, following her mother's script, decided on an approach of charming boldness. "Oh, what magnificent creatures!" she exclaimed, her voice a silver bell in the oppressive quiet. "Are they yours, Your Grace?" "They are," he said. She took a step forward, her hand outstretched. "May I?" It happened then. A low rumble started deep in the chest of the larger hound, Brutus. It was not a sound of aggression, but of profound warning, a vibration that seemed to shake the very air. Cassian, the other hound, flattened his ears and showed the barest sliver of his teeth. They did not move toward her. They simply stood, a living wall between her and their master, their disapproval a palpable force in the room. Honoria froze, her hand hovering in the air. A flush of hot shame crept up her neck. To be snubbed. By dogs. The Duke watched, his expression unreadable. He did not command them. He did not apologize. He simply observed. 1 second, 2 seconds. The silence was excruciating. It was the Dowager who broke it, her voice strained. "They are protective. Very protective." Honoria snatched her hand back as if burned. She forced a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Of course. Loyal beasts." But the moment was broken. The carefully constructed artifice of the visit had shattered. The hounds had passed their verdict, and in the grim silence of Thornhold, it seemed their word was law. The rest of the visit was a painful formality. The Duke spoke only in monosyllables. The hounds never left his side, their quiet, judgmental presence a constant indictment of Honoria's intrusion. When their carriage finally rolled away, grinding its protest once more on the grey gravel, Honoria burst into tears of fury and humiliation. "They growled at me, Mama. The beasts growled." Lady Finch stared back at the receding castle. "Yes," she said, her voice thin. "But the Duke, my dear, the Duke did not." And that, she knew, was somehow worse. Inside, the Dowager Duchess Isabella Vaughan watched the carriage disappear. She leaned her head against the cold window pane. This was the third beautiful, accomplished, perfectly suitable young woman who had been met with the same silent canine hostility and the same human indifference from her son. Alaric stood by the fire, one hand resting on Brutus's great head. The hound leaned into his touch, its earlier tension gone. "She was not suitable, Alaric," Isabella said, turning from the window. "No," he agreed. "None of them are suitable." "Not for them," she said, gesturing to the dogs, "and therefore not for you. Is that to be the way of it? Will you let this house be ruled by the whims of 2 hounds?" "They are good judges of character," Alaric said, his voice flat. "Better than most." "They are grieving for Edmund, just as you are," she snapped, her control finally breaking. "But Edmund is gone. A year it has been. This house is a tomb. I had hoped, I had thought a new wife, a new life." Her voice broke. He did not look at her. He simply stared into the flames. "Do not speak of him." The words hung between them, cold and sharp. The chasm that had opened a year ago, on the day his younger brother's horse had come back riderless, yawned between them. Isabella retreated, gathering the tatters of her composure. She had tried to fill the silence of this house with the chatter of a new bride. She had failed. The silence, it seemed, had teeth. She needed a new plan. If noise and beauty would not work, perhaps the opposite would. She did not need another prospective duchess. Not yet. She needed something else. She needed quiet. She needed peace, an anchor in the storm of her son's grief. That evening, she wrote a letter not to a society matron in London, but to her man of business in Newcastle. The request was unusual. She was not seeking a governess or a maid. She was seeking a companion for herself, a woman of gentle birth and good sense, someone quiet, unobtrusive, someone with no ambition, no agenda, someone who would not try to fill the silence, but could simply exist within it. Weeks later, a reply arrived. Mr. Henderson had a candidate, a Miss Clara Halewood, the daughter of a country vicar, recently deceased, who had left his child with a good education, impeccable manners, and precisely £7 to her name. She was 24, plain in a pleasant sort of way, and, by all accounts, possessed of a temperament as calm and steady as a summer evening. She was, Mr. Henderson wrote, a woman who knew how to be invisible. Isabella looked at the grim tapestries and the silent halls of Thornhold. A woman who knew how to be invisible. It was perfect. She was not hiring a future duchess. She was hiring a ghost. Clara Halewood's first impression of Thornhold Castle was that it was a place that had forgotten how to breathe. It rose from the rugged Northumberland landscape like a clenched fist of grey stone, defiant against the wind and the sky. The carriage journey from the village had been long and jostling, and as the castle loomed larger, a knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. She clutched her small valise, which contained everything she owned in the world. 2 spare gowns of grey and brown muslin, a book of poetry her father had given her, and a small, worn Bible. Her instructions from the Dowager Duchess's man of business had been clear. She was to be a companion. Her duties were to read aloud, to accompany the Dowager on walks, and to provide a restful presence. The salary was more than generous. It was a lifeline. For that, Clara was prepared to be as restful as a stone. The great door creaked open, and a severe-looking butler led her into the same hall that had so unnerved Honoria Finch. Clara felt her own smallness in the face of its grandeur and gloom. She was left to wait in a small antechamber, her hands folded in her lap. She could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of a long-case clock, a sound like a slow, tired heartbeat. After what felt like an age, the Dowager Duchess entered. She was as formidable as Clara had imagined, but there was a weariness in her eyes that was not unkind. She assessed Clara in a single, sweeping glance. The plain brown dress, the neatly coiled dark hair, the steady gaze that met her own without flinching or simpering. "Miss Halewood," the Dowager said, "welcome to Thornhold." "Thank you for having me, Your Grace," Clara replied, her voice soft but clear. The interview was brief. The Dowager asked few questions, seeming more interested in the quality of Clara's silence than her conversation. Clara, for her part, answered simply and honestly. She did not embellish her qualifications or feign an enthusiasm she did not feel. She was here to do a job. She was grateful for the opportunity. This was the truth, and she saw no reason to adorn it. "You will find us a quiet household," the Dowager concluded, a statement that felt like both a promise and a warning. "My son, the Duke, is a man of private habits. You will likely see little of him." Clara merely nodded. It suited her perfectly. A maid showed her to her room in a quiet wing of the castle. It was larger than any room she had ever had to herself, with a window that looked out over a walled garden, now mostly overgrown. The silence here was different from the oppressive silence of the main hall. It was a gentle, waiting silence. She spent the first few days in a quiet routine. She read passages from sermons to the Dowager in the morning, her voice even and calm. She worked on a piece of embroidery, her stitches small and neat. She walked with the Dowager in the gardens, listening more than she spoke. She learned the geography of the house, the names of the senior staff, the rhythm of its days. She learned that the household revolved around the unseen axis of the Duke's grief. The staff spoke in hushed tones. Certain topics were avoided. The West Wing, where the late Edmund's rooms had been, was kept locked. She did not see the Duke for 3 days. She was aware of his presence, a kind of low hum of energy in the house, but their paths did not cross. Then, on the 4th afternoon, the Dowager was resting, and Clara, seeking a moment of solitude, found her way to the one place that felt truly alive, the library. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories high, with towering shelves filled with the scent of old leather and paper. A ladder on a brass rail ran along one wall. Sunlight, thick with dust motes, slanted down from the high arched windows. It was a sanctuary of stories, a haven of quiet contemplation. Clara ran a reverent hand along a row of leather-bound spines. Here, she felt she could breathe. She was not alone. From the shadows of a wing-back chair near the fireplace, a voice spoke, startling her. "Can I help you?" It was the Duke. He was holding a book, but he was not reading it. He was watching her, and at his feet, lying like 2 carved stone effigies, were the hounds. Clara's heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. She had heard the staff whisper about the dogs, how they had terrorized the last visitor. She looked at them now. Their massive heads were resting on their paws, but their eyes, intelligent and watchful, were fixed on her. She did not scream or start back. She simply stood her ground, her hands clasped in front of her. She looked from the Duke to the dogs, and then back again. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady. "I did not mean to intrude." The door was open. Alaric said nothing. He watched the hounds. He watched the woman. He was waiting for the fear, for the flattery, for the foolish cooing that women seemed to think his dogs wanted to hear. Clara did none of those things. She looked at the hounds, not as beasts or status symbols, but as creatures. She saw the tension in their powerful shoulders, the wary intelligence in their gaze. They were guards, not pets. They were guarding their master's broken heart. She gave a small, respectful inclination of her head, a gesture that included both man and beast. "They are beautiful," she said, her voice a low murmur. It was not a compliment designed to please. It was a simple statement of fact. Then she did a strange thing. She did not try to approach them. She did not offer a hand to be sniffed. She simply knelt right there on the dusty Aubusson carpet, tucking her plain skirt around her. She did not look at the Duke. She looked at the hounds. "Hello," she whispered. Brutus, the larger of the 2, lifted his great head. A low sound rumbled in his chest. It was not a growl. It was a question. Clara did not move. She remained kneeling, making herself small, unthreatening. She met the hound's gaze without challenge. "My father had a dog once," she said, her voice still a whisper. "A little terrier. He was very brave." She was not talking to the Duke. She seemed to have forgotten he was there. She was speaking only to the hounds. Cassian, the more nervous of the 2, whined softly. He shifted, his claws making a soft scratching sound on the floorboards. Alaric watched, mesmerized. He had seen these dogs, his loyal shadows, react to strangers 100 times. They were unerringly polite to the staff they knew, and unnervingly hostile to anyone they perceived as an interloper. They had never encountered a reaction like this. This quiet, respectful stillness. Slowly, deliberately, Brutus rose to his feet. He was immense, a creature from an older, wilder time. He padded silently across the space that separated them. He stopped a foot from her, his head on a level with hers. He lowered his massive head and breathed in her scent. He smelled not of fear or perfume, but of soap and fresh air and old books. Clara did not move. She did not even seem to be breathing. And then, the miracle. The hound leaned forward and gently, with a surprising delicacy, licked her hand. Then he turned, walked back to the hearth, and lay down, resting his chin on his paws, with a sigh that seemed to come from the very soul of the house. Cassian, after a moment's hesitation, followed suit. They did not just tolerate her. They accepted her. They lay at her feet, two great furry guardians, and closed their eyes. Clara finally looked up at the Duke. Her cheeks were slightly flushed, but her eyes were calm. Alaric found he could not speak. A knot he had not even realized he was carrying in his chest had loosened. For the first time in a year, a person had entered his space and brought not noise, but a deeper, more profound quiet. A quiet that was not empty. A quiet that was peaceful. He cleared his throat. You are not afraid of them. It was not a question. Fear is a choice, Your Grace, Clara replied softly, rising to her feet. And a useless one, in most circumstances. She gave a small curtsy, and without another word turned and left the library, leaving the Duke of Thornhold alone with his thoughts and his two faithless, traitorous, wonderfully discerning hounds. And for the first time in a very long time, Alaric Vaughan, the cold Duke of Thornhold, felt the faint, unfamiliar stirring of something that might almost be called hope. Life at Thornhold settled into a new, quiet rhythm. Clara's presence was a subtle thread woven into the heavy tapestry of the household. She was there, but she was not. She performed her duties to the dowager with a gentle efficiency that was both comforting and unobtrusive. She read from Milton in the mornings, her voice a calm current in the still air of the drawing-room. She accompanied the dowager on slow walks through the gardens, her arm a steady support on the uneven paths. She learned to read the moods of the house. She knew that the clatter of a dropped tray in the kitchen could echo through the halls like a gunshot. She knew that the Duke's days were divided between his study, the stables, and long, solitary rides across the moors. She knew that the name Edmund was a ghost that sat at every dinner, a silent, unseen guest. The castle itself began to respond to her presence. It was not something she did consciously. It was in the small things. Finding a vase of wild flowers on a dusty mantelpiece in a forgotten hallway. A maid taking a cue from Clara's own quiet courage, daring to open a heavy velvet curtain to let in the morning sun. The scent of baking bread, which Clara had quietly requested from the cook, began to permeate the lower floors. A warm, domestic scent that fought back against the cold stone. Her most profound effect was on the Duke, though neither of them would have acknowledged it. Their interactions were brief, almost non-existent. A nod in a corridor. A shared, silent moment in the library. Yet her presence was changing him. From Alaric's perspective, it was a deeply unsettling experience. He had cultivated his isolation, honed it into a shield. He had wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his grief, a grief so vast and sharp, it felt like the only real thing left in the world. The women his mother had paraded before him had been assaults on that solitude, their bright chatter and false sympathies like stones thrown at a wounded animal. Clara Halewood was different. She demanded nothing. She did not try to cheer him. She did not offer platitudes. She simply existed, her quiet dignity a strange sort of mirror. In her presence, he was forced to see the state to which he had been reduced. A man hiding in his own house, a prisoner of his own sorrow. He found himself engineering reasons to be in the same room with her. He would take a book to the library in the afternoon, knowing she often sought refuge there. He would not speak to her. He would sit in his usual chair by the fire, the hounds at his feet, and read, or pretend to read. Mostly, he would watch her. He watched her as she traced the faded maps in an old atlas, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched her as she carefully mended a tear in a tapestry, her fingers nimble and sure. He watched her as she read, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips at a turn of phrase. She was not beautiful in the dazzling, ostentatious way of a Honoria Finch. Her beauty was quieter, a slow burn. It was in the gentle curve of her neck, the intelligence in her clear grey eyes, the way she could sit in perfect stillness and seem entirely complete in herself. One afternoon, he found her in the walled garden. It had been his mother's pride. But since Edmund's death, it had been left to go wild. Brambles choked the rose bushes, and weeds sprouted between the paving stones. Clara was on her knees, wearing a pair of thick gardener's gloves she had borrowed from the groundskeeper, patiently pulling weeds from around the base of a stone sundial. He stood in the archway for a long time, just watching. The afternoon sun caught the stray wisps of hair that had escaped her neat coil, turning them to threads of dark gold. Brutus and Cassian, who had followed him, trotted directly to her. Brutus nudged her shoulder with his great head, and she paused in her work to scratch him behind the ears. "You'll have a fine time getting those thorns out of your coat, you foolish thing," she murmured to the dog. Alaric stepped out of the shadows. "The gardener is paid to do that." She looked up, startled, but not afraid. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "He has more important things to do, Your Grace, and I find I have a great deal of time on my hands." She went back to her weeding. He found himself at a loss. He should have been annoyed at her presumption. This was his garden, his ruin. Instead, he felt a strange pull. He walked over and stood beside the sundial, looking down at the Latin inscription carved into its base. Horas non numero nisi serenas. I count only the sunny hours. My brother liked this garden, he said, the words coming out rough, as if they had been stored under pressure for a very long time. Clara stopped pulling weeds. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the ground. "Did he?" she asked softly. He said it was the one place in the castle where the stone didn't have the last word. Alaric continued, surprised at his own voice, at the memories bubbling up. "He planted those rose bushes with our mother, the white ones. He called them his ghost roses. He pointed to a tangled, thorny mass that was barely recognizable as a bush. A single, stubborn, white bloom was struggling to open amidst the decay." Clara looked at the rose. Then she looked at the Duke. For the first time, she saw past the cold facade to the deep, aching wound beneath. She saw not a Duke, but a man drowning in loss. "Perhaps," she said, her voice gentle, "they just need a little help to breathe again." She did not offer sympathy. She offered work, a practical, tangible solution. It was a language he understood. He did not reply. He turned and walked away, the hounds trotting at his heels. But something had shifted. A seed had been planted in the barren ground of his grief. The next day, when Clara went to the garden, She found a pair of smaller gardening gloves, a trowel, and a pair of shears laid out neatly on the stone bench. She looked around, but the garden was empty. She smiled, a real, genuine smile, and picked up the tools. They began a silent collaboration. He would not work with her. That would have been too great a breach of the chasm between their stations. But he would leave things for her. A bale of straw to protect the tender shoots from a late frost. A book on rose cultivation left open on the library table. And she, in turn, worked. Slowly, patiently, she began to reclaim the garden from the wilderness. She pruned the roses, cleared the paths, and planted new seeds in the bare earth. And as the garden began to breathe again, so did the house. And so did its master. The Dowager Duchess watched all of this with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She saw the change in her son. The rigid set of his shoulders had eased. The impenetrable silence had been replaced by a watchful quiet. He was still grieving, but he was no longer lost in the fog. He was present. She owed it all to this quiet, unassuming girl, this companion she had hired to be a ghost, who had instead become the most solid, real presence in the house, and a part of her, the part that was a mother, was profoundly grateful. But another part of her, the part that was a duchess, was worried. She had seen the way her son watched Clara Halewood. It was not the way a duke looked at his mother's companion. Society had rules, lines that could not be crossed. She had brought Clara here to bring peace, not to create a scandal. Her anxieties came to a head when she received a letter from Lady Finch. The letter was a masterpiece of polite inquiry, filled with feigned concern for the Duke's health and well-being, but its true purpose was clear. Lady Finch was not giving up. She was subtly, skillfully, reminding the Dowager of the unspoken understanding that had existed between their families. She was asking for another chance. Isabella read the letter with a heavy heart. A match with Honoria Finch was, on paper, perfect. It would unite two powerful families. It would provide Thornhold with a duchess of impeccable breeding and social grace. It was what was expected. It was the safe, correct path. She looked out the window at the walled garden. She could see Clara, a small figure in a plain dress, kneeling in the dirt. And she could see Alaric, standing by the archway, watching her. The Dowager Duchess was a practical woman. She had wanted to heal her son, and in a way she had succeeded. But the cure, she feared, might be more dangerous than the disease. She made a decision. It was a cold, calculated decision, born of a lifetime of duty and social obligation. She would do what was necessary to put things back on their proper course. She would invite Lady Honoria back to Thornhold. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The news of Lady Honoria's impending visit descended upon Thornhold like a sudden frost. The staff, who had begun to relax into the gentle rhythm Clara had established, grew tense again. The butler's back seemed to stiffen. The maids scurried with a renewed, nervous energy. The brief, fragile peace was over. Clara learned of it from the Dowager herself. They were in the morning room, the embroidery hoops lying idle in their laps. Lady Finch and her daughter will be joining us for a few days, Clara, the Dowager said, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere over Clara's shoulder. I shall require you to make sure the guest suites are prepared. Of course, Your Grace, Clara said, her voice even. Her heart, however, gave a painful little lurch. She remembered the whispers from the staff, about the beautiful visitor who had been so thoroughly routed by the hounds. Lady Honoria is a lively presence, the dowager continued, as if trying to convince herself. I am hoping she might brighten the atmosphere. Clara said nothing. She knew that the atmosphere at Thornhold had already brightened. It had brightened because of wild flowers and open curtains, and a garden being brought back to life. It had brightened because the Duke had started to speak in full sentences. She also knew that she, a vicar's daughter, with £7 to her name, had no right to think such things. Her job was to be restful, and if the dowager now required her to restfully prepare for her own replacement, then that was what she would do. Lady Honoria Finch arrived not with quiet weariness, but with the force of a cavalry charge. She brought with her a mountain of luggage, a lady's maid with a perpetually sour expression, and an aura of supreme, unassailable confidence. Her humiliation on her last visit had, it seemed, been transmuted into a steely resolve. Her reunion with the hounds was a carefully stage-managed affair. The dogs were confined to the Duke's study when she first entered the house. When she was presented to them later, in the drawing-room, she kept a careful distance, addressing them in a tone of bright, condescending cheerfulness that made Clara's teeth ache. "Ah, such big, brave boys," she chirped, wagging a finger at them from across the room. Brutus and Cassian were unimpressed. They did not growl this time. They simply ignored her, turning their great heads to look for Clara, who was standing quietly by the door. Finding her, they both padded over and sat at her feet, their bodies a warm, solid wall of loyalty. The gesture was not lost on anyone in the room. Honoria's smile tightened. The dowager looked deeply uncomfortable. And Alaric? Alaric watched Clara, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his own lips. The almost smile. It was there and gone in an instant, but Clara saw it, and it felt like a shared secret. Honoria, however, was not a woman to be deterred by dogs. She had come to conquer a duke, and she set about her task with military precision. She was dazzling. She wore gowns of jewel-toned silks that made Clara's plain muslin look like a shroud. She played the pianoforte with a brilliant, technical skill that filled the silent house with noise. She recounted witty anecdotes from her London season, her laughter echoing in the high-ceilinged rooms. She treated Clara with a kind of pitying condescension that was far more cruel than outright hostility. "Oh, Miss Halewood, you must be so bored here, with only us old folk for company," she would say, with a little laugh. Or, "That is a very practical shade of brown, Miss Halewood. So sensible." Clara absorbed the little cuts with her usual quiet grace. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were exactly what a woman like Honoria wanted. Instead, she simply continued with her duties, her calm demeanour an infuriating contrast to Honoria's frantic efforts. The real battle, however, was for the Duke's attention. Honoria tried to engage him on every front. She talked about politics, about horses, about art. Alaric responded with his customary economy of words. His monosyllabic replies and long, thoughtful silences were a fortress she could not breach. He remained polite, distant, a man observing a play in which he had no interest. His real attention was elsewhere. It was in the walled garden, where he would find Clara in the early mornings, her hands in the earth. It was in the library, where they would sit for hours in a companionable silence that was more intimate than any conversation Honoria could force. One evening, After a particularly trying dinner, during which Honoria had dominated the conversation with a lengthy and detailed account of a ball, Clara retreated to the library. She needed to feel the solid presence of the books around her, the quiet wisdom of the ages. She was not alone. Alaric was there, standing before the fire, one hand on the mantelpiece. The hounds, as always, were at his feet. "She is very energetic," Clara said, by way of an opening. Alaric turned to look at her. The firelight cast shadows on his face, making it seem even more stark and elemental. "She is a siege engine," he said. Clara could not help but smile. "She does seem determined to take the castle. She will find the walls are higher than she thinks," he said. He took a step closer to her. The space between them seemed to crackle with an unspoken energy. "She thinks the prize is a title and a fortune." "And is it not?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The prize," he said, his gaze intense, "is peace, and she does not know the meaning of the word." He looked at her calm face, and her steady eyes. "You do." His proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the heat from his body, smell the faint scent of leather and cold night air that clung to him. She felt a dizzying pull toward him, a desire to close the small space that separated them, to see if the peace he saw in her was something she could offer him. But she was Clara Halewood, the vicar's daughter. He was the Duke of Thornhold. And in the drawing room, a beautiful, ambitious woman was playing the pianoforte, staking her claim. She took a step back, breaking the spell. "The Dowager will be looking for me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Good night, Your Grace." She fled. Alaric watched her go, a muscle working in his jaw. He had come so close to what? To telling her that her quiet presence had become the anchor of his world? To telling her that the thought of her leaving was now more terrifying than the grief he had lived with for so long? He knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that this could not continue. The situation was untenable. His mother's well-intentioned meddling had created a battlefield in his own home, and Clara was caught in the crossfire. The final confrontation happened a few days later. It was a rainy afternoon, and the castle felt even more oppressive than usual. Honoria, bored and frustrated by the Duke's indifference, had turned her attention to finding fault. She had complained about a draft, about the quality of the tea, about the slowness of the service. Her target, as always, was indirectly Clara. They were in the drawing room. Honoria was describing, in excruciating detail, the proper way to arrange flowers, a pointed critique of the simple vase of wildflowers Clara had placed on the mantel. "One must consider colour and texture and height," she declared, gesturing with a dismissive hand. "A simple bunch of weeds, however quaint, simply will not do for a ducal residence. It suggests a certain lack of refinement." The Dowager sat stiffly, her face pale. Clara, who was mending a tear in the Dowager's shawl, kept her eyes down, her stitches small and even. Alaric, who had been standing by the window, turned. "I find them charming," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of command. "They are honest, unlike some of the other decorations in this house." His eyes met Honoria's. The insult was unmistakable. Honoria's face went white, then a blotchy, furious red. She turned her fury on the safest target. "And you!" she snapped, pointing a trembling finger at Clara. "You, with your meek little act. Do you think we are all fools? Hiding in the library, digging in the dirt like a common labourer. You think he doesn't see you for what you are? A scheming, ambitious little nobody, trying to work your way into his affections. Clara looked up, her expression one of quiet shock. The accusation was so far from the truth, so grotesquely unfair, that it left her breathless. Before she could speak, before Alaric could move, it was the dowager who rose to her feet. Her face was a mask of cold fury. "That is enough, Miss Finch," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "You are a guest in this house. You will not speak to a member of my household in that manner." "A member of your household?" Honoria laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "She is a servant, a paid companion, and you have let her make a fool of you all." It was the final, unforgivable sin. She had broken the unspoken rules of class and decorum. She had brought the ugliness of the transaction into the open. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Lady Finch was summoned. Apologies were made and rejected. Within the hour, the Finch carriage was called for, and Honoria was dispatched, this time for good, her dreams of a ducal coronet in tatters. The drawing-room was silent in the wake of her departure. The rain beat against the window panes. Clara stood, her hands trembling. She felt exposed, violated. The quiet world she had built for herself had been torn apart. The dowager looked at her, and Clara saw not anger, but a deep, profound weariness. And something else. "Fear, Clara," the dowager said, her voice barely audible. I think it is best if you were to leave." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Leave? But why? She had done nothing wrong. "Your Grace," she whispered. "The situation. It has become untenable," the dowager said, not looking at her. She was looking at her son, who stood like a stone statue by the window. "I brought you here to bring peace. Instead, this. It was a mistake." Alaric turned from the window, his face thunderous. "Mother, you cannot be serious." "I am perfectly serious," she said, her voice gaining a brittle strength. "Miss Halewood has been an exemplary companion. I will give her a most generous reference, and of course a full year's salary. But her employment here is at an end. You are punishing her for Honoria's vulgarity," Alaric said, his voice dangerously low. "I am protecting this family," the dowager retorted, her voice rising. "I am protecting you. Do you have any idea the scandal that would erupt? A duke and his mother's companion? I will not have the Vaughan name dragged through the mud. I will not have this house, which has already endured so much gossip, become a subject of ridicule." It was a cold, cruel calculation. Clara was the sacrifice, the pawn to be swept from the board to save the king and queen. Clara looked from the dowager's set, unhappy face to Alaric's furious one. She saw the truth of it then. She was the problem. Her presence, which had once been a solution, was now the source of the conflict. As long as she was here, this battle would continue. She drew herself up to her full, slight height. Her quiet dignity was the only armor she had left. "I understand, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady, though her heart was breaking. "When would you like me to leave?" "Now is not necessary," the dowager said, a flicker of shame in her eyes. "In the morning will be sufficient." "I would prefer to leave now," Clara said. She could not bear to spend one more night in this house that had felt so much like a home, only to have it snatched away. "If you would have a carriage made ready." She did not look at Alaric. She could not. She curtsied, a final, perfect gesture of deference, and walked out of the room. She did not run. She walked with her head held high, leaving the two of them alone in the ruin of the afternoon. The silence that fell in the drawing room after Clara's departure was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with unspoken accusations, with the bitter taste of regret and the sharp sting of injustice. The rain lashed against the windows, a mournful percussion to the wreckage within. Alaric stared at his mother, his face a mask of cold fury. "You have made a grave mistake," he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. Isabella sank into a chair, her bravado collapsing. She looked suddenly old and frail. "What was I to do, Alaric? Did you not hear the girl? The accusations she made? They were vulgar, yes, but they were not untrue in their essence. The whispers would have started. You are a duke. You cannot be seen to be dallying with a servant." Dallying? The word was like a whip crack in the quiet room. "Is that what you think this is? You see her quietness, her kindness, her courage, and you reduce it to a sordid little affair? She has done nothing, but bring light back into this house. She brought you companionship. She brought the garden back to life. He stopped, unable to say the words. "She brought me back to life. Fram, she is a good girl, a fine girl," Isabella conceded, her voice trembling. "But she is not one of us. Her presence here has become a complication. I did what was necessary to protect the family, to protect you." "You did not protect me," Alaric said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You protected a name, a title, an abstract concept of honor. You have sacrificed a living, breathing person for the sake of appearances. You have chosen the tomb over the garden." He turned and walked towards the door. "Where are you going?" his mother cried, a note of panic in her voice. "I am going to fix the mistake you have made," he said, without looking back. He did not go after Clara immediately. He knew she was a woman of pride and principle. To chase after her carriage would be to create a scene, to compound her humiliation. He had to give her space. But he could not bear the thought of her alone, cast out into the world with nothing but a handful of money and a broken heart. The house felt hollow, utterly and completely hollow. He walked the halls, the hounds pacing restlessly at his side. They whined low, mournful sounds, nudging his hand with their wet noses, sensing his distress. He went to the library. The book Clara had been reading was still on the table, a ribbon marking her place. He picked it up. A single wildflower, pressed between the pages, fell into his hand. A ghost of the garden, a ghost of her. He went to his study and poured a brandy, his hand shaking. He caught his reflection in the dark glass of the window. He saw the same cold, remote man he had been a year ago. No, worse. Then he had been numb. Now he could feel. And what he felt was a tearing, agonizing loss. He had lived in a grey world of grief for so long, he had forgotten what colour looked like. Clara had been colour. Not the loud, garish colours of Honoria Finch, but the soft, gentle hues of a sunrise, the quiet green of new shoots in a winter garden, the warm gold of firelight on a beloved book. And his mother, in her fear and her blindness, had plunged him back into the grey. He spent a sleepless night, pacing the stone floors of his castle like a caged animal. The hounds would not settle, their disquiet a mirror of his own. By dawn, he had made his decision. His mother had spoken of duty, of protecting the family name. But what was that name worth if it was built on a foundation of cold, empty stone? His duty, he now realized, was not to a title, but to a heart. To his own heart, which he was finally able to admit was inextricably bound to the quiet girl his mother had sent away. He did not inform his mother of his plans. He simply ordered his horse, a powerful black stallion, to be saddled. He dressed not in the formal attire of a duke, but in the sturdy, practical clothes of a country gentleman. He gave instructions to his butler. A room was to be prepared, the finest guest suite, and the fires were to be lit in every room. "I want this house to be warm when I return," he said. He rode out, as the morning mist was still clinging to the hills. He did not know for certain where she had gone, but he knew she had no family, no home to return to. She would have gone to the nearest respectable town, to find a boarding house, to begin the soul-crushing process of looking for a new position. He spurred his horse on, the animal's powerful stride eating up the miles. He was a man on a mission. Not a duke reclaiming his property, but a man seeking his future. Clara had taken a room at a respectable, if threadbare, boarding house in the town of Alnwick. The room was small and clean, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out onto a brick wall. The landlady, a Mrs. Gable, was a kind woman with sad eyes who asked no questions. Clara had sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after arriving, her hands folded in her lap, the silence of the little room pressing in on her. She had not cried. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a cold, hard knot in her chest. She had allowed herself, for a brief, foolish time, to feel at home at Thornhold. She had let its stones and its gardens and its broken, silent master seep into her heart. And now she was paying the price. She had been dismissed, sent away like a faulty piece of furniture. The generosity of the severance pay was almost more insulting than the dismissal itself. It was blood money, a price paid to assuage a guilty conscience. She had considered refusing it, but her father's practicality had won out. Pride was a luxury she could not afford. She spent the next day in a fog of quiet despair. She tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. She tried to plan, to think about her next steps. A new position. Another household, another family's sorrows to quietly manage. The thought filled her with a weariness that went bone deep. On the second morning, she was sitting by her small window, mending a tear in her glove, when she heard a commotion in the street below. Horses. A powerful animal being reined in. The landlady's voice, high with excitement and confusion. Clara paid it no mind. It was a market town. Horses were common. Then there was a knock on her door. Not Mrs. Gable's timid tap, but a firm, solid knock. "Miss Halewood?" a man's voice called. Clara's heart stopped. She knew that voice. She would know it anywhere. She stood, her hands suddenly cold, the glove dropping to the floor. She smoothed her dress, a pointless, reflexive gesture. She walked to the door and opened it. The Duke of Thornhold stood in the narrow, dimly lit hallway. He filled the space, his height and the breadth of his shoulders seeming to suck all the air from the corridor. He was dressed for riding, his boots dusty, his dark hair wind-tossed. He looked not like a duke, but like a force of nature. They stood for a moment in silence. He looked at her, his grey eyes searching her face. He saw the new sadness there, the faint shadows under her eyes. And it was a knife in his gut. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice low. She stepped back, holding the door open. He entered the small room, and it immediately seemed to shrink, the humble furniture looking like dollhouse toys in his presence. Mrs. Gable was hovering in the hallway, her eyes wide. He turned and gave her a look, not of command, but of quiet request. She scurried away. He turned back to Clara. He did not know where to begin. The speech he had rehearsed on the long ride over seemed foolish and inadequate now. "The hounds miss you," he said at last. It was so unexpected, so absurd, that a small, watery laugh escaped her. "The hounds? They will not eat," he said, his expression completely serious. "Brutus spent the entire night with his nose pressed against the crack under your bedroom door. Cassian has been howling. The staff is threatening to quit." She looked down at her hands. "I am sorry to hear that." "I do not think you are," he said gently. "And neither am I. It is a house in rebellion. A rebellion against your absence." He took a step closer. "I miss you." The words, so simple, so direct, struck her with more force than Honoria's tirade. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "My mother was wrong," he continued, his voice raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. She was afraid. Afraid of what people would say. Afraid of breaking the rules. But the rules are what broke this family in the first place. The rule that says a man does not show his grief. The rule that says a title is more important than a heart. He reached out and took her hand. His was warm and calloused, engulfing hers. "My brother, Edmund, he would have loved you." This, more than anything, undid her. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "He was the sunny one," Alaric said, his voice thick with memory. "The one who planted the roses. When he died, all the colour went out of the world. I thought it was gone forever. I thought I was condemned to live in the grey. And then you came. You did not bring the sun back. You did something far more difficult. You taught me how to see the beauty in the shadows. You taught me how to live in the quiet. You did not try to fix my grief. You just made a space for it. And in that space, something else began to grow." He looked around the small, bare room. "This is not your place, Clara. Your place is not in a hired room in a provincial town. It is not as my mother's companion, or as anyone's servant." He took a deep breath, the words he had come to say finally ready. "Your place is at Thornhold, as its mistress, as the Duchess." He paused, his grip tightening on her hand. "As my wife." Clara stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was impossible. A dream. A fairy tale her practical vicar's daughter mind could not accept. "You are asking this because the hounds are unhappy?" she whispered, a last-ditch attempt at self-preservation. A slow smile spread across his face. The first real unguarded smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his harsh features, making him look younger, impossibly handsome. "I am asking this because the hounds are excellent judges of character," he said, "and they, and I, have judged you to be the only woman in the world who can make that cold, broken castle a home. The only woman I wish to spend the rest of my days with. I am asking, Clara, because I love you." He had never spoken her name before. He had always called her Miss Halewood. The sound of it on his lips, spoken with such tenderness, was her undoing. The cold knot in her chest dissolved, replaced by a tide of warmth so powerful it threatened to sweep her away. She did not give him an answer in words. She simply raised her other hand and placed it over his, her answer in her touch, in the light that dawned in her eyes. He understood. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture of profound reverence. "Come home, Clara," he said. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Alaric." Their return to Thornhold was quiet, but triumphant. When the carriage pulled up the long gravel drive, the entire staff was gathered on the steps. Not at the Duke's order, but of their own accord. As Clara stepped out, a spontaneous cheer went up. The butler was seen to wipe his eye. The cook beamed. Brutus and Cassian, who had been held back by two struggling stable boys, broke free. They bounded toward her, not with boisterous leaps, but with low, joyous whimpers, circling her, nudging her hands, their great bodies trembling with happiness. Clara knelt and wrapped her arms around their massive necks, burying her face in their rough fur. Finally, home. The Dowager Duchess was waiting in the great hall. She stood alone, a small, proud figure in her black silk. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. She had had 24 hours to contemplate the ruin of her plans and the silence of her son. She had walked the cold, empty halls of the house she had tried to protect and realized the terrible mistake she had made. She had chosen the name over the heart, and in doing so, had almost lost both. She looked at Clara, this quiet girl who had single-handedly brought her son back from the brink of despair. She saw not a servant, not a complication, but the future of her family. She walked forward and took Clara's hands in her own. Her touch was cool, but firm. "Miss Halewood," she said, her voice steady. "Clara, I owe you an apology. I was wrong. I allowed fear to guide me, and I caused you a great deal of pain. I hope that, in time, you will be able to forgive me." Clara looked into the older woman's eyes and saw not a duchess, but a mother who loved her son and had acted out of that love, however misguidedly. "There is nothing to forgive, Your Grace," Clara said, and she meant it. "You wanted your son to be happy." "Indeed," the Dowager said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "I just did not realize that I was standing in the way of it." She squeezed Clara's hands. "Welcome home, my dear. Truly." Epilogue. 6 months later, the first snow of winter fell on Thornhold. It was a gentle, blanketing snow that softened the hard edges of the castle and muffled the world in a profound silence. Inside, however, the castle was anything but cold. Fires blazed in every hearth. The scent of pine and cinnamon hung in the air. The long, cold dining table had been replaced by a round one, where the Duke, the Duchess, and the Dowager Duchess now took their meals together. The house was not loud. It was not filled with the forced gaiety the Dowager had once thought she wanted. It was filled with a deep, resonant peace. In the library, the heart of the home, Alaric and Clara sat before a roaring fire. He was reading a report from his estate manager, but his attention was not on the page. It was on his wife, who sat curled in a large armchair, a book in her lap, her feet tucked under her. A soft woolen shawl, a gift from the Dowager, was draped over her shoulders. At their feet, lying in a contented, tangled heap, were Brutus and Cassian. Their great heads rested on the hearthrug, their sides rising and falling in the slow, even rhythm of sleep. They were no longer guards on duty. They were simply dogs in their proper place, at the feet of their master and mistress. Clara looked up from her book and met her husband's gaze. He smiled at her, a full, easy smile that was no longer a rarity. "What is it?" she asked. "I was just thinking," he said, setting his papers aside, "about the sundial in the garden." "Horas non numero nisi serenas," she murmured. "I count only the sunny hours." "I used to think it was a lie," he said, "a pretty sentiment for a world that is mostly grey. But I was wrong. The sunny hours, they are not about the weather, are they?" "No," she said softly. They are not. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. My life was all winter, Clara, and I thought spring would never come. But you did not bring the spring. You brought me the courage to live through the winter. You taught me that even in the greyest of days, there is warmth. There is peace. There is love. He stood and pulled her to her feet, drawing her into his arms. He held her close, breathing in the familiar, beloved scent of her. The house was quiet. The world outside was white and still. The past was not erased. The ghost of Edmund would always be a part of their story, a bittersweet ache in the heart of their happiness. But it no longer had the power to haunt them. The garden was sleeping under a blanket of snow, its roots strong, ready for the spring. And in the great stone castle of Thornhold, two people, brought together by a pair of wise and discerning hounds, had finally, truly come home. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.